Will the government ban Bitcoin? They sure have the incentive to. But in order to answer this complex question, we have to go back to the 80s and 90s to learn about the fight for freedom in the digital age. Today, we look at some of the early giants of the cryptography movement, shoulders Satoshi himself stood on in order to eventually create the ultimate symbol of freedom in the digital age. In a world trending towards surveillance and tyranny, can Bitcoin become a tool for resistance? Welcome to Bitcoin Daily. I'm Dante Cook, head of Swan Business. This morning on Cafe Bitcoin, Swan's daily Twitter Spaces show, I had the privilege of interviewing Professor Andrew Bailey, one of the co-authors of the latest book, which should be on my shelf soon, Resistance Money. I've started reading the e-version of the book while I'm waiting on the physical copy. And if you haven't picked it up, you should. In one of the beginning chapters, when he's talking about the genesis of Bitcoin, he dives into the history of cryptography, which was simply a means for people to defend against the tyranny and overreach of governments. Starting with a person like Judith Malone, who was an early activist and was arrested several times as a criminal in the civil rights movement, but was also a self-taught programmer and early cypherpunk who said that girls need modems. She created the courage in others to begin resisting authority when fighting for basic rights and freedoms that we all deserve as humans. She paved the way for the cypherpunks, which started in the 1970s. And me being a history nerd, this prompted me to think back to the 80s and 90s and how that time and period relates to the time and age where we are today, where people have questions like, will the government ban Bitcoin? Well, we actually have a case study that I want to dive into today. In 1977, three guys, Rivest, Shamir, and Adelman, created the first paper that talked about public key cryptography. The paper was called A Method for Obtaining Digital Signatures in Public Key Crypto Systems. The paper marked a seminal moment where it highlighted a way for us to be able to unveil a public key encrypted, but not disclose the decryption key or the private key to that message or packet of information. This work inspired well-known cypherpunk and hidden hero Phil Zimmermann. Phil Zimmermann became known for his work on modern protocols like voice over IP, which enable technologies like Skype, Zoom, Teams, FaceTime that we use every day in our normal lives. But he also created this software called Pretty Good Privacy in 1991, the largest known encryption software for email that we use today. You see, the reason why he published this, and he published it as the first version of open source software, or what they called guerrilla freeware, where he actually just put copies of this on floppy disks or on sheets of paper and mailed them across the world in order for normal everyday people to encrypt private messages that they had via email. You see, at the time, the government wanted the ability to peer into individuals' messages. This effort was spearheaded by Senator Joe Biden, who proposed the Comprehensive Counterterrorism Act and Violent Crime Control Act in 1991. The government wanted the ability to see the private messages of people if a judge ordered that they could in court. They tried to prosecute Phil Zimmermann under the Munitions Act in 1993, citing that this was an act of terrorism, exporting this code to people outside of the United States and other places throughout the world. A federal grand jury opened an investigation on this man. They labeled him a terrorist, and the messaging that the government used throughout all media outlets was clear. Cryptography would empower criminals, pedophiles, and terrorists. Where have we heard that before? The trial would loom in court for 3 years. Meanwhile, the government tried to also push forward an agenda with some new technology that they created through the NSA called Clipper chips. They tried to partner with manufacturers like Intel in order to put these chips that would intercept communications in computers everywhere around the world. Although this attempt would be denied, in 1995, in response to the Oklahoma City bombings, and in 2001, in response to the terrorist attacks, they actually created the ability to surveil people without needing a court order in order to do it. Historically, the government has always leveraged the crisis as an opportunity to expand their reach and their powers into private affairs. In 1996, they finally found that Phil Zimmermann was not guilty because they ultimately agreed on the platform that he ran, that code is speech. And by limiting our ability to use our speech, we are going against our First Amendment rights. His foundations paved the way for many cypherpunks after him, people that we now celebrate, like Nick Szabo, or even guys like Hal Finney. The goal was to make something that the world had already experienced: peer-to-peer payments, anonymous and verifiable transactions through cash, and make it so that it was available in a digital form. Digital cash was the ultimate goal. But this quest had many roadblocks and many failures along the way, because people couldn't solve problems like the double spin problem or the throat to choke problem, in that if there was somebody who was attached to a project, they could ultimately shut it down by means of rules and regulations. And so, until Bitcoin, this quest for digital cash seemed impossible. Listen to this quote, an excerpt from Resistance Money from a guy named Finn Bruton, on why digital cash was so impossible and so impractical and wasn't solved until Bitcoin. The work of making cash digital means creating an object that is trivial to transact over network computers and easy to verify, to prove that it is what it appears to be, but impossible to forge or duplicate. And that can carry the information about what it is and what it's worth without generating any information about how it's used or by whom. This is a set of seemingly paradoxical and impossible demands. It must be available, but scarce, unique and anonymous, but identifiable and reliable, and easy to transmit, but impossible to copy. It must have all of these attributes in the context of technologies that were designed and built to make copies in their very functioning, costlessly, immediately, and perfectly. The Bitcoin white paper represented 40 years of fighting, struggling, and resistance through free speech. It's a quest that we all humans desire to go on, a quest to defend our basic rights and freedoms. How do you enact digital costliness in an era where anything can be replicated, copied, or recreated infinitely? How do you ensure that it maintains permanence while also providing value to users right now? But how do you do all of that without anyone controlling it? Bitcoin is truly a miracle. So in this current discussion of will the government ban Bitcoin, they certainly will try, and they have every incentive to. But there's tens of thousands of resistors who run their own nodes, their own Umbrel, their own Raspberry Pi, their own Start9 Labs node in their home. And when they do, they're championing free speech for the billions of people who don't have free speech and are unable to defend their basic rights and freedoms. Those who still live under neocolonialism, who although may be seemingly free or free on paper, but practically slaves, because they're unable to store value or store wealth or create prosperity for themselves when the money is controlled. A great example of this is explained in this clip by Eric Kaysen in the latest episode of 21 Voices, right here on the Swan YouTube channel.
The financial repression very much is the secondary capacity to imperialism, which the French control the currency of these 14 countries because they imperialistically owned them as a people before. And the only reason why they left was because they were able to create this sort of financial imperialism that these people now suffer under. Without control of their own currency, they're always at the behests of needing to pay the French first and foremost, which they do at their own suffering. So most of these countries and people have never even had the opportunity to ever create any meaningful kind of economic development because any wealth that they do save is stolen by the West from them. And Alex Gladstein's most recent book that covers the repression that the IMF and the World Bank do under the guise of sponsoring countries and helping them restructure their debt is anything but. He was able to trace the capital flows of that about $83 billion have flown from the global south, the world's poorest countries, into the global north, the world's richest countries. What could have those people done with $83 billion in capital investment in their own country that was actually for them and for themselves? And because they don't have any ability to invest in themselves now, they turn to people like the Chinese to come invest in mega projects that won't be profitable for them because the Chinese will own it directly and will use that to exploit their resources into the coming century. And so one of the things that I think is the most hopeful aspect of Bitcoin, and I've had incredible conversations with people that are doing mining operations out there, is that this is the first real opportunity that these people have had for development in a meaningful way, with not only them getting electricity for the first time, but once they understand Bitcoin, they have the ability to hold a self-sovereign currency. And pretty much all countries in Africa suffer endemic inflation, where most people are losing upwards of 50% of their wealth per year towards inflation. Could you imagine having half of your purchasing power stolen from you every single year just because you live in a particular nation state? That not only seems horrifically unfair, But when we actually look at our own relationship to it and how the full global financial system operates in tandem with it to create this sort of financial imperialism, it's very important to trace these relationships and understand that we as Americans directly finance that sort of financial repression that happens in other places.
I highly recommend checking out the full clip of 21 Voices and how Bitcoin will enable people to get out of neocolonialism. And if you haven't gotten a copy of Resistance Money, I highly recommend that you do. And if you're one of those people who are afraid that the government will ban Bitcoin, just look at how they tried to ban email as an example just 30 years ago. And with that, we're signing off for today. This is Dante Cook with Swan.com. Happy stacking.